Episode 54 of the Intercooler Podcast, and I suspect, Andrew, we're going to spend the next 40 minutes or so demonstrating why we write and talk about cars rather than run the companies that build them. But I don't know,
Yes.
We'll see. Perhaps you'll be more insightful than I'm anticipating I will be.
I wouldn't hang your hat on it.
Okay, so in this episode we're sort of imagining that we are the CEOs of particular car companies, and we're going to say what we would do in that position. And I mean, we could really trip ourselves up here, couldn't we?
Not that we are in any way utterly and profoundly unqualified to make any of these decisions. Well, we've all made predictions, haven't we, about or said in the past what car companies should do in the future, and they never do.
Yeah.
And most of them are still here. There's probably a very good reason why they don't, but we're going to have a go. So I think, the first to say, although the opinions that we express will be serious and are genuinely our opinions, I wouldn't necessarily take them, as being absolute gospel and, oh yes, of course that's what they should do, because it's just a couple of idiots who know nothing about business talking about what we'd do if we were in their position.
It certainly is that. Okay, so if I was a CEO of a big car company, my first point of order would be no more April Fool's gags ever. A blanket ban. None of those. This, in light of what's happened over in the US for Volkswagen over the past few days. I suspect you've had half an eye on that. What did you make of it all? Do you think it's total storm in a teacup, or is there more to it than that?
Do you know, there's a bit of me which thinks that thinks it's a work of genius, because the very fact that you and I are sitting on this podcast talking about Volkswagen and talking about electrification, which frankly, had they not done this, we would never be dreaming of doing. Is that not proof that whatever it was they were trying to do has worked? It was a publicity campaign. And, we look at it, we think, oh God, that was a great joke which went terribly wrong. And, Volkswagen shouldn't be seen to be in any way being less than entirely, truthful about it, particularly given what's gone on, particularly in the US. But actually, I think there will be people in Wolfsburg and at head office in the US who are actually thinking, this hasn't played too badly for us.
Yeah, that's an interesting take.
What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think it's such a, for the most part, I think it's such a fuss about nothing. I mean, come on, who cares? As I understand it,
of course,
they were preparing an April Fool's gag for April 1st, and it leaked a few days in advance. And rather than just go, okay, it leaked, we'll hold our hands up, it was a joke, they appeared to double down on it and insist that it really was happening. They tried to style it out, as far as I could tell. And it got to a point where a handful of very serious journalists over in the US, working for proper grown-up organisations like Reuters, got in touch with the press office in the US to ask if this was genuine. And it was at that point that somebody somewhere took a decision to say, yes, it is genuine. We really are changing the name to Volkswagen. And so the consequence of that was that these journalists went back to their editors at these very grown-up titles and said, it's safe to run the story, it really is happening. And that seems to be what a hardcore group of people are getting upset about.
Because I guess if you had no sense of humour whatsoever, you would say that Volkswagen lied to the media.
Yes, that is the accusation, isn't it? And it's
in the context of everything that's gone on over the last 5 years. That just shows that you just hear them, can't you? Oh yes, the bad practices that were there then remain to this day, and you can just see them sort of taking this joke and just blowing it into something it was never intended to be, and extrapolating way past the point where all logic suggests you should just understand what it was meant to be, and okay, maybe it went wrong, maybe it didn't, but just move on. And just making it, as you say, a massive fuss about a joke.
Yeah,
it's a joke.
It got well out of hand, didn't it? And dearie me, I think people probably did take it a bit too seriously. Okay, well, we won't bang on about that anymore. Ryan Barnes, that was for you because you asked us to spend a couple of minutes talking about the whole VW.
Thank you, Ryan.
April Fool's fiasco. So there we go. Hope you enjoyed it. Okay, so to get us started on this week's podcast, a mantra of mine is that you shouldn't criticise anybody or their actions until you've really understood their position, until you've understood what the pressures are on them, what the limitations are on them, why they make certain decisions. I think it's very easy for people on the outside to look in and go, why have they done that? That's stupid. But in truth, all these decisions within big car companies are made under enormous pressure and with very real limitations. And so everything that I say in this podcast, and I'm really just talking for myself here, it's a sort of considered, honestly held point of view, but I say it advisedly because I suspect the moment you're parachuted into one of these organisations and you understand what the pressures are, you have a sense of why things were done that way or why things weren't done that way. And so probably the way that you think about what a car company should and shouldn't do is completely changed. So
yeah, but that's not your fault, is it? Car companies employ entire departments of people to manage their message, don't they? They're called press offices, marketing departments, and it is their job to make sure that the public in general, and particularly people like you and me, only get that side of the story, which they want you to get. And if there is, if there are internal difficulties, if there are, if there's civil war in the boardroom, if the money's running out, those are all parts of the stories we never hear. So, we cannot, even though we are journalists, and if anybody's meant to be able to come to an informed judgment about these things, it's us. We can't, because we genuinely, unless we have, and it's very, very rare that this happens, we somehow have the ear of a CEO who's prepared to tell us all of it. And usually they won't do that, because apart from anything else, these guys are accountable not just to their board, but usually to their shareholders too. And so we just don't get the thing. And your other point about trying not to pronounce on stuff until you're fully in the picture. I mean, obviously, clearly that's not possible. The rule, when I was the editor of Motorsport magazine, I always had a hard and fast rule that if you were going to shoot down somebody else's idea, let's say somebody came up with an idea about anything from a headline for a story or some feature you want to run, no one was allowed to say, no, that's a shit story, that's a shit headline. You had to be able to say, you could say that's a shit story, that's a shit headline, but only if you could then say, here's a better one. Yeah? So it turns something positive into something negative and something positive. And so what I think we're going to try and do is come up with some positive thing, rather than just sitting here going, oh, Aston Martin shouldn't be making that, Ferrari shouldn't be making that. Yeah. We're going to be saying what they should be making instead. And of course, the whole world's going to be hanging off our every word. And product plans will be changed for all time as a result of this podcast.
Oh yeah, this will be listened to in boardrooms around the world. So just to reinforce that point that I made, I just want to give one example. As a car guy, someone who loves fast cars, I probably wouldn't choose. I probably wouldn't have Lamborghini make the Urus, because it's absolutely not the kind of car that I get a kick out of, that I enjoy. However, if I was the CEO of Lamborghini and it was my responsibility to make that company stable and profitable and grow and deliver returns for the shareholders, all that sort of stuff, I probably would decide to do the Urus, because it helps do all of those things. Having said that...
But it also...
Go on.
Sorry. It also means, this is the point that I completely failed to get about the Cayenne when it came out 20 years ago. It came out, and I was absolutely front and centre of the queue of Porsche bashers saying, this is outrageous, this is Porsche betraying its legacy, it's never going to work. People don't, and as in many things I'm about to say in the next half an hour, I couldn't have been more wrong. What I didn't appreciate was the relationship between the cars that we wanted Porsche to build and the cars that Porsche wanted to build, because it was the credibility of things like the 911 which made people want Cayennes, and it was the profits that were realised by the Cayenne which allowed people, Porsche, to then to continue invest in cars like the 911s. And if you look at the volumes of these cars, I mean, 2/3 of everything Porsche sells these days are SUVs, at least. cars like the 911, they probably wouldn't exist these days if it wasn't for the fact that they've got these SUVs, which we all are slightly sniffy about, providing these massive profits because they're big margin cars and they sell in large numbers, and so they make enormous amounts of money. And that's why we can have GT3 RSs. And but 20 years ago, I didn't understand that relationship. And so every time we go, such and such a company shouldn't be building an SUV, it's the wrong thing for this company to be doing. You have to think, well, if they don't build that SUV, what else does that decision then mean they won't be able to build to? Maybe it's a car you do want them to build.
What are the consequences? Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah. And it's probably no coincidence, is it, that Porsche has been building the Cayenne for 20 years or so. And in that time, its sports cars have become probably the most consistently very highly regarded vehicles of their type. I mean, it comes hand in hand, doesn't it? Okay, well, do you want to plonk yourself into the CEO's chair at the board table of a particular company? Do you want to get us started?
Well, I think the first thing I would like, if I can start sort of slightly more generally, and say that, I expect we're going to spend more of our time talking about quite low volume, sort of more sporting car manufacturers, because that's where I think people who listen to this podcast would want us to be. And the difficulty for these people is always cash. It's always just keeping enough money to keep particularly development programs. If you're going to develop an all-new car from scratch, that requires an enormous amount of money, and you have to keep the. I mean, that's why companies like Ferrari and Aston Martin and McLaren and so forth, they love doing these specials. These really, because it's basically it's the deposits for those cars, which do so much to fund, the programs of the for the bread and butter cars, which actually they derive their volume from, and it's really difficult. It's particularly difficult if you haven't got somebody's arm around your shoulder. If a company like McLaren, I mean, fair play to them. They're not like almost every other company owned by some massive international conglomeration. They are owned by they have some shareholders, but it's not as if they've got Volkswagen. And the problem is that even if you've got shareholders with quite a lot of money, even if the money itself is not the particular problem, if you think of the facilities, if you think of the technologies that a company like Volkswagen can bring to a company like Lamborghini or Bugatti, if you haven't got that, and I'm sure this is behind, for instance, the reason that Mercedes now owns a 20% stake in Aston Martin rather than a 5% stake in Aston Martin, because you just have to be able to access this stuff, because otherwise it is so difficult when you're up against companies that are part of the largest car company in the world. It's really difficult, and that when times get tough, these cars companies can struggle. Things can get very difficult. They tend to when they have cars they can sell, they tend to sort of knock them out. And maybe sometimes make too many of them, and that, as we know, has ongoing effects as well. And all the while, there is this, the elephant, isn't it, in the room of electrification. How do you find the money to fund the programs which are going to produce a new generation of cars you don't know anyone's even going to want,
and which the infrastructure to support doesn't exist?
Yeah. I mean, these guys who run these companies, I take my hat off to them, because, we think we have we have to scratch our heads a bit because we're trying to do, we're trying to launch a new online magazine. Compared to being a CEO of a car company, and also the other thing is, it's serious stuff because it's people's jobs, isn't it? It's thousands of people's jobs. It's serious stuff. And you make the wrong call, you go the wrong way, and you produce the car, you stake your future on the car that people, it turns out that once we get to that future, we don't know where it is and we don't know what it's going to look like, we don't know when it's going to be, but you get there and actually it's not the car that people want. Game's up. And you haven't got a Volkswagen to go, oh well, that was an interesting experiment, didn't work, let's try something else now.
It's possible that there's never been a more difficult time to steer a car company than now.
I agree. I agree. I absolutely agree.
You wouldn't want to do it, would you? And I suspect someone like Andy Palmer has an awful lot to say about this. I just don't envy those guys, I have to say, who are in
but
that
I mean,
position.
Andy Palmer, who you and I both know, his great belief was that he could keep Aston Martin independent, and he wanted to stay in charge of the company, understandably so, and. Well, I mean, it remains to be seen, doesn't it? But, he's not there anymore. Mercedes owns, 3 times more of the company than it did when he was there. And for me, I don't see in the 21st century how these companies can indefinitely stay completely independent without some kind of arrangement with another larger company which can provide them with a safety net and with the technology and with the investment that they need.
Well, I think we've chosen a good place to start. Aston Martin, you are the CEO. Congratulations. You've just landed the job.
Thank you very much.
CEO of Aston Martin.
Yes.
Everyone's very proud. We've had a party. A bit hungover, but on Monday morning you have to start in this new role. DBX might be a good place to start. It's quite clear that, led by Andy Palmer, Aston said, well, if we're going to do an SUV, we're going to do it properly. And we're not going to rebadge anybody else's. We're going to build our own platform. And we're going to build a factory, a brand new factory to manufacture this thing in. I mean, that's an enormous undertaking. Was it the right one, though? Should they have just stuck some new body panels on a GLS or something?
They always said that they couldn't make that car look like an Aston Martin. And if you look at the DBX they created, it's a for an SUV, it's a great looking car. That said, if you look at what Volkswagen's, if you think that an Audi Q8 and a Bentley Bentayga and a Lamborghini Urus are all spun off the same platform. Now, you may or may not think that any one of those cars is good or not good looking or whatever, but you can't say they look the same. A Bentayga and an Urus do not look the same. And so there is clearly within a platform, or maybe it's just Volkswagen's platform, there is considerable. I mean, I know, for instance, the Volkswagen platform, you can have. I think it's available in 3 different wheelbases. And clearly, you can clothe it in very different ways. So I never quite understood that point. And whether it was, I'd need to see the books to know whether it was a good idea to do your own platform in your own factory. I mean, at the time, it struck me as being unbelievably bold and ambitious, maybe too bold and too ambitious. But it's difficult to sit here and pronounce, yes, absolutely, they shouldn't have done that because they didn't have the money. And it was, because, A, we don't know the numbers. We don't know what it cost. We don't know how much money they had to spend of it. And B, the evidence to date, I don't hear stories of, things falling off DBXs, of the factory lines breaking down or anything. I've not heard any stories of that particular experiment having gone terribly wrong for them. So maybe it'll be fine. But I think the problem is that at the moment they've only got one car on that platform. So it's like in our world, in the magazine world, there are big publishing groups which have lots and lots of magazines because then they can share the distribution costs, they can share the paper costs, they can share the print costs, and they can do all that. You get massive economies of scale. But if you've built a factory which is brand new, and you created a platform which is brand new, and those 2 things come together to make one car, difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, you need to amortise those costs somehow. So I think it's probably, we know this is going to happen. There needs to be some sort of plug-in hybrid version because people living in cities will soon need them, if not now.
Have to be.
But we think that is going to happen, don't we? That we think that's the tie-in with Mercedes-Benz is going to facilitate that.
Yeah, I think it is going to happen, but I don't think. I mean, it depends how quickly they can engineer it. But it certainly wasn't on the immediate horizon, of which I was aware at least when Andy Palmer left. But I mean, I don't think that car can come too soon. You and I might just sort of groan and think about, oh God, plug-in hybrids. But it's car manufacturers have to make cars that their customers want to buy. And their customers may want to buy these cars, not just because they drive amazingly, look fantastic, but, because actually they can afford them because they're hybrids and therefore their tax bill comes down. And it's a pretty unglamorous reason to want to buy a car. But if it works and the cars sell, then those are the cars you've got to make.
It's true. I suspect, that Aston Martin, the credit that it should have got for building the DBX in the way it did on a bespoke platform was probably lost in all the frustration that Aston Martin was building an SUV in the first place. It's an interesting. It's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. But
I'll tell you the one thing about Aston Martin which I thought was a shame when it got kicked into the long grass, and I think that they could do it, particularly with the increased nature of their relationship with Mercedes-Benz. I thought the electric Lagonda was a good idea.
Yeah, I agree.
Because, if you think about, we all worry about electric McLarens and electric Ferraris and electric Lamborghinis because we can't see, and we've had this conversation on this podcast a few times, we can't see how you make a sports car, an electric sports car, exciting to drive. An electric luxury car, what do you want from a luxury car? You want silence and you want effortless power. You want an electric luxury car, don't you? You just do. And also, there is nothing in that space at the moment. I don't know when Rolls-Royce are going to go all electric, but it's not for years. Bentley aren't going to go all electric for years. In that super high luxury space, there was an absolute opportunity with a great name. I think that Lagonda is still a name that resonates. It's not like Maybach, which barely anybody could remember. I think Lagonda is a fantastic name. I think they had the name. I think they had the idea, and and I think that they could just, based on an EQS. Maybe they're going to do this now. Maybe this is part of the plan. Maybe Tobias is listening to the podcast going, haha, if only you knew what I knew. I mean, maybe that's what they're going to do. And maybe they will take the EQS platform and they will rebody it and they will call it a Lagonda. And as long as it looks right, I think that would be a really smart thing to do. And it saddened me that they kicked it into the long grass. Yeah,
it would have been a smart thing to do. And clearly there'll be probably financial reasons for not doing it just yet. But the other upside of that strategy was that no one is wedded to the idea of a Lagonda with a big combustion engine, the way that we are with Aston Martins or with Ferraris or with Lamborghinis. So you could come along with an electric Lagonda, and idiots like us aren't going to go, an electric Lagonda, what? Well, you just sort of accept it, don't you? And you see the virtues in it.
It could be really cool.
Yeah, it could be really cool.
Really funky and really cool. Yeah.
Let's hope it does happen then.
I mean, that's a kind of electric car that I could really get on with, he said. But no, you know what I mean. I mean, that's what I mean by that is that objectively, as a working journalist, that's the kind of electric car which I could see, a really, really good case for. In the same way that I could see a really, really good case for electric city cars.
Yeah, potentially being better than the combustion engine equivalent.
Absolutely.
That's the point.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so what about the rest of the Aston Martin lineup? What are you doing with the performance cars?
I don't think you need a DBS, a DB11, and a Vantage, and a mid-engine car, and a sort of, let's not talk about the sort of Valhalla because that's kind of a special, isn't it? So, but I mean, at the moment they are heading for having a Vantage range, a DB11 range, a DBS, the SUV, and the Vanquish, the mid-engine car, and for little Aston Martin. I think that's just too many cars. I think I would amalgamate the DB11 and the DBS into a single car. I'd probably drop the DB11 because the DBS is clearly the higher margin car. And then I'd just do more things with what I got. I'd definitely stick a V12 in the Vanquish. Not in the Vanquish, sorry, in the Vantage. Because we know it fits, and I think that could be a hell of a machine. Hybrid in the DBX, and also just not do what do they do? The submersible, the helicopter, the jetcraft, the hotel, the Miami condo, block, and exactly, and all that sort of thing. And then think a bit more about pricing, and just control supply. If I'd say anything to these car manufacturers, is just control the supply, because I understand completely the temptation to, suddenly you come across this, you discover yourself that you have a car that you can sell. And so, of course, you sell them. But, there's that old adage about selling one less than the market demands. And if you can do that, and therefore you can keep on top of your residuals, then, that's what, Porsche have done so well. It's actually what Ferrari have done, very well. They... And they sort of and also they do very clever things like create. If you look at things like GT3 RSs or Pistas or these are cars which traditionally people have regarded as being very special and think of it limited in nature, but they're not. They make as many of them as they can sell, and yet they create this aura around them where they are somehow different, they're somehow special. And they love people, like you and me, whinging about other people we've heard of who can't get one. They've tried hard, really, really hard, and they're really important people, and they can't get a GT3 and everything. And Porsche said, "This is just lovely because it all just, builds this image of these being special, unobtainable, wonderful things. And it's all about building an aura, isn't it? It's all about building an image. And I would just try to do that." A lot more carefully. So I would have fewer ranges. I'd do more of the ranges that I've got, and I would reignite the Lagonda project.
Do you think?
But base it on a Mercedes all-electric platform.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think there's a case for scrapping the Vantage? Maybe replacing it with a similarly priced mid-engine car? If you
look, Ferrari is the example because Ferrari have done so well. I was talking to a friend of ours who is rather more accomplished in the world of business than you or I, and he was saying that what Ferrari has done so well is that the world outside, the market, if you like, particularly the financial market, sees Ferrari not as a car manufacturer but as a luxury brand, like a sort of Louis Vuitton or whatever. And if you can do that, then you're in a whole other world, particularly in terms of your margins and everything else. And if you look at what Ferrari were charging for their entry-level car 10 or 20 years ago, compared to what they're charging now, it's just done that.
Yeah.
I can remember somebody who doesn't work there anymore told me, you remember the 540C McLaren? The entry-level McLaren, which actually I drove once and I really, really liked, and I thought, actually, this is really good. I can remember somebody saying to me that they did that because they didn't have the confidence to not do it. They just felt because the company was so new, they had to have that offering in the marketplace. And they said if they'd had their time again, they wouldn't have done that car. Because effectively it cost them the same to make as a 570S, which they could just charge 25 grand more for. And so they're effective for every 540C, that was 25 grand they weren't going to get. And so I think that there is an argument for Aston Martin to either not do the Vantage or just push it up, just really, really push it up and up and up. And the problem you get with that is if you just say, okay, well, we're only going to sell V12 Vantages, then it kind of butts into the mid-engine car, doesn't it? Because, it's a high-powered, expensive, two-seat, crazy car. I think there is. But that would require Aston Martin to decide to be a different sort of company because, your volumes will be a lot lower if you don't have that kind of car. But, my view of that would be, well, I'm Aston Martin. We're never going to be a volume manufacturer. The Aston Martin, to me, if you had a choice between being high volume, low margin or low volume, high margin, well, clearly, Aston Martin is absolutely in the latter category. So, I think if it made financial sense to do it, then, I'd bite that bullet.
Yeah, move up a notch. It's kind of like the Dyson syndrome. And I know it's such a sort of emotionally charged brand for a lot of people now, but what they never do is undervalue themselves, and they charge for certain products, they charge multiples of what you would pay for a comparable product from another manufacturer, yet people pay for them. They just do, and it's a phenomenally profitable business. And so it demonstrates
but it's like like Porsche, isn't it, and Ferrari, they have big margins on their things, and they don't discount anything. And also the other thing, the other game that Ferrari play better than anybody else on earth is the options game. Yeah. I mean, if you think about the amount of money it'd be very interesting to know that if you just take the average Ferrari, whatever it is, an F8 Tributo that they sell, boom, and Ferrari, if you could get Ferrari to tell you how much profit came from the base car and how much profit came from the options that were attached to that base car, I'm betting plenty they make more out of the options than they do out of the car. And so that's a game which your carbon fiber boot linings and all this nonsense that these people put on their cars, and the way that, and I have a little insight into this because I may know a few people who've been through this process, and the way that Ferrari just sort of, and through their dealerships, they just sort of nurture their relationship and gently persuade you that actually, if you want to sell this car again, Mr. Prosser, then actually we think you ought to have this on that because that's what people really, really want, and we're just looking at, and that is great. And people go into these things with their eyes open, and and all's fair in love and war. So, yeah, all sorts of things really.
I think. That option strategy runs right the way through Ferrari, from the boardroom to the factory to the dealerships, and to the point where, and this is anecdotal, perhaps it's not true, someone will tell me, but I think if you go and spec a new Ferrari and you sit there in the spec room and you've got your car up on the big TV, they're slinging all these optional extras onto it and not telling you how much each one costs. And it's only when you walk out at the end that you're presented with a piece of paper with the bill on it. And most people, they don't want to go, oh God, that's too expensive. Can you take these away? That. Yeah. And so even if it's a bit rich for them, they swallow it, don't they?
It would be interesting, wouldn't it, to go into a Ferrari dealer and say, I want to buy an 812. And they go, fine. Shall we talk about the options? And you go, no, I don't want any options. I'd just like an 812, please. I
think they'd invite you to leave.
I don't know. I don't want any options at all. I just want an 812, please. Your list price for this car is 200 and whatever it is.
Yeah,
here's a check, 812, please.
It would
Go
be
and build me an 812.
I think they'd be very, very reluctant to do it, wouldn't they?
I don't know. It's all right. I don't want CarPlay on it. I don't want anything on it.
Yeah.
I don't want parking sensors. I don't want embossed headrests. I don't want shields. I don't want any of that. I just want an 812, please.
Bare bones 812.
Oh. If someone's listening to this, could someone who's got more front than me and is unlikely to be okay, could someone just do that and just go into any supercar dealership and just try and order a standard car with no options on it and see what kind of response you get?
It would be very interesting, wouldn't it?
The other thing, the other big revenue stream is finance as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Certainly in the mass market.
They love lending you money, don't they?
Yeah, they do, and to the point where, it's been described. Ford, for instance, has been described as a bank more recently than a car manufacturer.
With a car company attached to it. Yeah, absolutely right.
It's incredible because that's where they make their money. It's just amazing, really. Okay, well we've been through Aston Martin. I think we should probably talk about some of the others. We have mentioned Ferrari and McLaren and Lamborghini. I think one of the things that I would want to do if I headed up one of those companies would find a way. I would want to find a way to cash in on this movement towards naturally aspirated cars with manual gearboxes, lighter, smaller, not so much about lap time, because there does seem to be a real move towards this, particularly within the enthusiast market. And I suspect that for a car configured in the correct way, you could charge an absolute fortune for it.
Are you talking about like a sort of Gordon Murray type car, or?
No, I mean,
tell me the car that you envisage, because my fear is that what you say is wonderful but wrong. That I just, what I have come to realise over the decades I've been doing this job is that we're weird. We are weirdos.
That's true.
Okay, that we in no way represent popular public opinion and what we want. And when I say we're weird, I don't just mean Dan Prosser and Andrew Frankel. I mean everybody listening to this podcast, everybody who is on, the 45,000 people who very kindly follow the Intercooler and so on, and what I would call proper car enthusiasts, because in total we're still not a very large number of people.
No.
And what we want, isn't enough to keep any car company alive, I fear. But you think that a certain sort of precisely targeted car could find sufficient resonance with enough people to earn to pay back the cost of its creation?
Well, it's so finger in the air, isn't it? I would be surprised if there wasn't a case to be made somewhere, and even if it was a loss leader, right? Because it would be dangerous for these car companies to completely disregard the enthusiast market entirely, because they do need people like us, but also owners out there in the market praising these cars and longing to own these cars. And the moment that you disregard people like us and build machines purely for, you know, people in central London who are literally going to drive around the congestion charging zone in their supercars, I think over time you lose an awful lot of credibility, and that surely is what these companies sort of trade on more than anything else. I just think it's important that they continue to produce vehicles that really do get people like us going, and Porsche with their GT cars is perhaps the best example of that at the moment.
But I mean, you are absolutely correct, and Porsche do that. But you know, they are Porsche, and they do have a lot of other stuff, and you know, we don't actually know how much money they make out of this. I suspect they do make money out of GT3 RSs, but nobody's ever said to me that they do make money. I mean, what worries me about that approach, and anybody who 35 minutes into this podcast thought we might actually go an entire podcast without mentioning your Alpine A110, I'm afraid I'm about to disappoint you. But you look at the Alpine. Now, what do we know? We know three things about the Alpine. One is that it's a wonderful car. Secondly, that it's not selling very well. Thirdly, that you can't get a manual gearbox. Now, if you can't have a manual gearbox, if there's not the market for a stick in a car like an A110, and we know that there is a market, and we know that Alpine say that there's nothing they'd like to do more than put a stick in an A110, but there just isn't enough demand out there to justify the cost of doing the engineering program that would be required to do that. If you can't even do that for an Alpine, what chance is there for anything else? Because surely if there's a car of the kind that you're talking about, the Alpine is it.
Well, I think realistically, you're looking at a much higher price point than the Alpine, probably 10 times that, because there has to be margin in it. I so wish that there was demand for an Alpine-sized car with an NA engine with a manual box, but realistically, you know it, I know it, it's just not out there. You can't build a case around that kind of vehicle at 50, 60 grand. But at £500,000, maybe you could. I just think, do the likes of Ferrari want smaller independents like Gordon Murray Automotive to come along and mop up that whole sector? Or do they need to have half an eye on it and go, well, at some point we're going to have to claim our slice of that pie?
Yeah, I mean, it is, isn't it? You know, it's all about credibility and it's all about the product. But the thing is that, you know, although, you know, something like a Pista doesn't have a manual gearbox, you know, when we go and drive Pistas, we still come away thinking and saying, wow, that's an amazing piece of kit. Yeah. And, you know, and the one thing you cannot accuse Ferrari of is resting on its laurels and just sort of ignoring the product. There was a time, when would it have been, sort of 30 years ago, when Ferrari did absolutely do that, and it had a bit of a product drought, and it got itself into a bit of trouble in the early 90s. But for everything else that Ferrari does well, you know, and we laugh about, you know, about the finance and the options and the way that they, you know, manage their customers and everything else, they can only do that because they make bloody good cars. And at the end of the day, everybody knows who buys one of those things that's what they're going to get, and the product stacks up. And to me, with all these things, and because I'm a fairly simple binary way of thinking kind of guy, it all just comes down to the product, isn't it? And again, without sort of wishing to sort of, you know, plug ourselves and what you and I will shortly be doing and talking more about. If anybody's heard about this online magazine we're going to be launching, it's going to be all about the product. And because, ultimately that's what, you can have all the marketing and all the finance and all the clever options, all the sort of peripheral stuff. But at the heart of it, you've got to have something that people want and something that's good. And I think that there are sort of some slightly strange parallels between, our world and that world. But, completely lost my train of thought, but no. Anyway,
okay, fine.
Ferrari,
well, okay.
Great manufacturer.
So just to wrap things up then, we know that these car manufacturers, particularly in Europe, have only 9 years now to carry on building combustion engine cars with no hybrid component. Now, would you quietly acquiesce to that and phase out development of combustion engines and gradually, the way that Mercedes-AMG is with the C63, move towards a 4-cylinder turbo engine with a hybrid component for the C63? Or would you, while you can, make hay while the sun shines? And would you, in the final throes of the combustion engine, would you really do what you could to celebrate them now? Or is that just not financially viable at all?
I think in an era of such colossal uncertainty, I think you have to, as far as possible, try to keep your options open. Because I am not, we sit here now and we've heard, car manufacturers, I think many of them far too quickly leap to say, right, fine, that's it. We're not going to be building, we're not going to be investing anything in internal combustion engines. We're going to go all electric. And car companies for whom their electric journey is going to be really, really bloody difficult. Because as we've said a million times, how do you build an electric sports car? How do you build an electric car that is great to drive? Nobody has yet to come up with a convincing answer to that question. And I would not slam the door completely shut on the internal combustion engine, because we have also talked about synthetic fuels and the possibilities that they bring. I heard, I think yesterday, that the Carrera Cup that supports the Grand Prix season, I think it's as of next year, is going to be fueled entirely by synthetic fuel. I understand that there are issues with it, but to me, they seem to me to be many of the same sorts of issues that you always get with emergent technologies. It's difficult to do, it's expensive, but if enough people get behind it, the numbers, Porsche say that in well-to-wheel terms, synthetic fuel is as clean as electricity. And you can make it all from renewables, and you can stick it in your internal combustion engine. And so with that knowledge, is it sensible to go, forget it, we're not going to do anything yet, goodbye internal combustion engines, our sports car brand, which means everything to us, we're going to stake it all on electric motors and batteries, which are the same in every car that you get, which have no distinguishing characteristics and are differentiated. So we will only be able to differentiate on price, which means one way we'll sell more cars than you is to be cheaper than you, and so everything gets driven down to the lowest common denominator, or it's fluffy stuff, it's options, and what you get then is a world of ultimately the way this is going is you will have a very, very small number of companies just creating platforms, and other car manufacturers will just bolt their own bodies onto them. Because why wouldn't you do that? Why would all the different car companies around the world each make their own skateboard? Because a skateboard is a skateboard, isn't it? It doesn't matter. They will have the same motors, they will have the same batteries, so why not just get one or two companies to make? Apparently all the television screens in the world are made by two companies, because a television screen is a television screen. And that's where we're going. Unless an alternative becomes available in the time that is remaining. And I would not, while there is breath in my body, turn my back against that, even the possibility of that being the case. I would keep a back door open, so that if it actually turns out that synthetic fuel or something else we haven't thought of does have some kind of future, that my company would then be in a position to make something of it.
10 years from now, as the boss of a sports car company, you might look back and go, crikey, we really should have looked a bit harder at this synthetic fuel stuff. If there's another company out there doing wonders with combustion engines still, I
think the answer is to do both. We have discussed. I mean, I think that electric architecture will get to the point where it actually is perfectly feasible for almost all journeys, almost all the time. And the world I see, cars are divided into transport and things you want to drive. And the transport's electric, and the stuff you want to drive is powered by synthetic fuel. I don't see why that can't happen.
Interesting. Well, there we go. I suspect we were both just about at the limits of our knowledge and capabilities there, weren't we?
Perish the thought.
Well, it'd be interesting to get some feedback on this and see what listeners think. But it's certainly, I think, the one thing we have highlighted is just how difficult it is to be leading one of these companies at the moment, because there are so many unknowns and such change, quite rapid change. So, yeah, again, I just don't envy the people who are steering these ships. Good luck to them all.
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll wind that one up there. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Remember to subscribe to the podcast, leave a rating and a review, please. That really does help. And we'll talk to you again next week.
Look forward to it. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.